Hey everyone, this is Shaman from Rocketship HQ, the mobile user acquisition firm that lets you grow in a capital efficient manner. My guest today is Adam Hadi, the VP of Marketing at the mobile banking app Current. Adam began his career as an economist at the Bureau of Labor Statistics and made his way into mobile app marketing for the Tops company. Since then, he's headed up marketing for leading apps such as Draft, Quidd, and now Current, and he's advised a host of other apps on marketing, specifically influencer marketing. Adam's experiences are fascinating because, with his background of quantitative, performance focused marketing, he would be an unlikely proponent of branding in marketing, and yet, in his present role at Current, he has embraced and championed driving performance while being very brand focused, even without massive brand marketing budgets. In this conversation, we'll dive into exactly why he finds branding so important for a performance marketer like himself. We'll dive into why branding matters, especially for high involvement products like fintech apps, and how Adam and his team approach branding. For someone like me that, much like Adam, is very performance focused, this was a refreshing and new perspective on how to look at marketing. I'm very excited to welcome Adam Hadi to the Mobile User Acquisition Show. Adam, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Shamath. It's an honor to be here. I'm an avid listener, and to be among the many esteemed guests that have been on your show is nothing but an honor.
Yeah, and you've been on our other podcast, How Things Grow. You told some very fascinating stories about what's inside of the influencer world. A lot of your past background is also one reason why I want to dig into our theme for today, which is the case for brand marketing in the world of algorithmic performance marketing. And I'm interested to dig in this with you because you have been an out and out performance marketer for a long time. You've been very performance focused. You've been very direct response focused. And in your latest role, you've done a lot of work on the branding side, on the brand marketing side. So certainly something I'm very curious to dig into, both your learning process, but where you look at the world differently. Start with, Adam, what were some of the first instances that first made you aware of the fact that you couldn't just be focused on performance, but you had to be balancing brand and performance? And if there are examples that come to mind, please share.
Well, I should say, you're completely accurate in that my background is totally in performance marketing, right? And me, just as a person, my skill set is really lends itself to performance marketing. There's nothing I'd say like inherently about me that make me some amazing brand marketer, right? I mean, I'm colorblind, right? like my sense for design, my sense for for creative is not is not exemplary, right? My skills don't lend itself there, but I think it was kind of more about the ability to recognize the importance of brand marketing is like in many ways more important than actually being able to execute upon it, at least as a performance marketer. And so you mentioned really what made me aware. It really was my consulting work, right? Like early on in my career, I just dealt with companies that lent itself much more to direct response marketing, to performance marketing than it did to brand marketing, right? I worked with a lot of companies in like the gaming space and daily fantasy sports, which is somewhat in the same realm. But it was really through my consulting work that I got exposure to lots of different clients and really began to recognize that this wasn't some big like, oh, it's either brand marketing or performance marketing. It's that depending really on what your vertical is and what your situation is, brand can be really, really important. In fact, I'll give you an example from early on in my career. I used to work at Topps, the baseball card company, right? And we had launched a digital apps division for digital trading cards. And I didn't even recognize it at the time, but I look back on that and I recognize now how within that vertical, how important our brand was, that we were
Mm-hmm.
able to brand ourselves tops, which,
Mm-hmm.
in the world of trading cards has this really strong impact, right?
Yeah.
And even though all of our marketing was nearly all of our marketing was direct response focused, um, that brand actually really helped us. And I kind of noticed things like that as I moved on with other brands that maybe didn't have that, right? In
Mm-hmm.
terms of like building like uh, validity, right? And trust. Um, and so yeah, I'd say that's it was really being able to work on across different
Sure.
verticals that made me realize
Sure.
that.
Sure. And it sounds like you saw brands like Tops that had decades of brand behind them, and you saw other apps that didn't, and you could see what sort of impact this could have, right?
Yeah. And I'd say a lot of this honestly was in hindsight. I'd love to say like I
Right.
had the clairvoyancy to view it directly at
Yeah.
the time.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
but a
Yeah.
lot of it is stuff that I've recognized later on.
Certainly. And marketing's become increasingly quantitative, algorithmic, automated, right? And as we know, there's like billion-dollar gaming companies that are basically built just because they've mastered user acquisition, they've mastered performance marketing. There are companies like Playrix, and I think this was our friend Eric Seufert who said basically, I think in one of his articles, he's like, there's no way a company like Playrix would ever hire a brand-focused CMO just because their entire business is built on performance marketing. So, and you could say the same thing about very many hyper-casual games. They would just not have any case for a CMO or a brand-focused marketer. How would you reconcile what you said about branding, what your experiences are around branding, and versus this perspective that there are areas, there are spaces where brand marketing, many would argue, is not very meaningful or impactful?
Well, I really, it's actually not an argument against that. I'm in total agreement with Eric in that argument, right? Because Playrix is in hyper casual games, there might not be a single vertical in the world in which brand is less important
Yeah,
than hyper casual games, right?
yeah.
It's just you need to think about a number of factors, right? I'd start with just basic human behavior, right? I don't need to trust a mobile game or a casual game to
Right.
download and install it, right? Like there's
Okay.
like trust, and that's not why I'm installing that app, right? And there's no major friction points, right? These games are optimized to be completely frictionless. Maybe not to even require a registration so much as for me to give them my name before jumping in and kind of engaging. There's not a moment where I need to be like, wait a minute, do I really want to do this? It's you know, it's a pretty seamless process, and also just human behavior in
Mm-hmm.
terms of when we make the decision to
Mm-hmm.
install a game, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like nobody's ever seen an ad for a hyper casual game and then decided 3 weeks later to install it, right? That's just
Right.
not how
Right.
humans and consumers interact with that, right? And that's very different than, let's say, a dating app, right? Where you may see like 100 ads for a dating app and have never converted, um, maybe because you're in a relationship, or maybe because it's not really what you want. And then there's an event that happens in your life, right? Maybe you go through a breakup, maybe you decide, yeah, now I need a search, and that's when you engage and you download. And so um, I think it's and for if we were talking about dating, I think having a big portion of your budget dedicated to brand marketing, and having brand marketers, really at the high levels, maybe not, necessarily at the highest level, is very imperative, right?
Sure. Yeah. It sounds like because fintech or finance is something that's very emotional, requires a lot of trust. That's why in your space, definitely it looks like having that brand component is so crucial as compared to
Yes.
games,
Yeah,
where
yeah, certainly, right?
more
Like so
casual.
I should mention, plug here for Current. I'm VP of marketing at Current.
Yeah.
Current's a mobile bank based here in New York. And we're really making and offering bank accounts that are accessible to people
Yeah.
regardless of income and age, right?
Yeah.
And so that means that a good portion of our users are paycheck to paycheck, right? And our goal is to really bring on their direct deposits, to have you switch your direct deposit over to us, where you won't pay minimum balance requirement, you won't pay overdraft fees,
Yeah.
And that is a big ask of
Yeah.
a user. There's tons of friction in that process, right? And there's
Yeah.
tons of trust. And what we see from users is, for example, I mean, they may be with like a Wells Fargo, right? And they might hate Wells Fargo, but Wells
Mhm.
Fargo is in many cases the devil they know. Like
Yeah.
Wells Fargo charges them, $16.99 a month, and then they get hit with a $34 overdraft fee, and they can't stand Wells Fargo, but they know that Wells Fargo isn't going to run away with their money, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that level of trust, right? Especially if you're somebody who's paycheck to paycheck, your next paycheck is all your money, right? So if I ask you, Shamanth, hey, please give me all your money, that's essentially the ask I'm making of all of the people I'm
Yeah.
advertising to. It's almost silly. It's very silly to compare, that type of marketing to marketing of a hyper casual game, right?
Yeah.
It's yes, we are both mobile apps, but that's about
Right.
where the similarities end,
Yeah.
right?
No, I think you're describing how somebody living paycheck to paycheck would look at Current and Wells Fargo. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I would say Wells Fargo, much like Tops, has decades of that trust built behind them. So even if they charge $16.99 extra, people sort of put up with it. And that's what you're coming up against. That's what you have to combat, I would guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, now that we understand why it's important, certainly in your space, how does the brand marketing execution happen on a day-to-day tactical level? And how do the brand marketers on your team evaluate success?
Well, so on a day-to-day basis, it's just that it's super integrated, right? We don't have a brand marketing team that only does brand marketing and a performance team that only does performance. It's much more integrated. Now, given our scale, right? And I should mention, Current, we raised our Series B this past fall of about $20 million. We're not in position to dedicate a huge portion of our budget just to brand marketing, right?
Mm-hmm.
To me, brand marketing really exists to support your performance marketing,
Mm-hmm.
and to kind of work hand in hand. So, if you're spending, $10 million a month on performance marketing, you could really benefit from some brand marketing to support that, right? But if your budgets are a lot more modest, then it doesn't make sense to have some huge brand marketing budget when nobody's going to see your performance ads, right?
Yeah.
And so, again, especially in our case, at kind of a more modest scale, it's just totally integrated. We're not talking about two completely different things here. It's integrating our brand and making sure that our values and the message that we're trying to deliver is still being delivered through our performance ads, right? And we're
Mm-hmm.
not going down this route of like performance over all else, which over time erodes your brand.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but again, to me, it's not unless you really understand um, your consumer, what drives them. It's these aren't very different worlds in my opinion.
Right. And just to dig in deeper into that, right? When we say brand marketing, that could mean a number of different things. You could run TV ads in every single state in the United States. You could take out magazine ads. You could get OOH billboards. So at a super tactical level, how do you decide what to pursue? And maybe you can even tell us what some of the top of mind things are right now for you in terms of initiatives you're pursuing.
Well, one thing I would look at, and actually a great example of this, and I'm familiar with it because it used to be in the space, was in daily fantasy sports a number of years ago, right?
Yeah.
These were
Yeah.
performance-driven companies when you talk about the FanDuels and DraftKings of the world, and they ran a lot of TV and they ran a lot of radio and they ran a lot of podcasts and ran on all these different channels, and they were very performance-focused with those. But they were not very brand focused,
Mm-hmm.
even though those are on like what you could call brand channels, right? And so you what you found was like a tremendous growth, right, in those two spaces. This is talking about like 5 years ago in like 2015, but everybody hated FanDuel and DraftKings, right? And like some people hated them because, hey, they used DraftKings, they lost some money, and they heard like they cheated or something. But everybody hated them because of their ads, right? And so like, and that's an example of you just totally eroded your brand in a way that's really hard and really expensive to recover from over time. And so that's what I mean. I mean, you can, people are going to see a lot and lots and lots of your performance ads. And if none of those ads are building your brand, you'll again, depending on your vertical, you'll find yourself really regretting it later on.
Understood. So it's almost like when you do your paid performance marketing, there are certain brand guidelines you want to make sure you adhere to, and you're not just optimizing to hit a D1 or D7 target if the messaging is completely off. Is that what
exactly
you're getting at?
Exactly, right? There has to be a balance there. And again, for an early startup, that balance has to be tilted heavily towards performance. If you ignore brand, it erodes over time.
And I do know you guys have done some interesting work with podcasts. I believe you guys had a podcast of your own, which
we developed a podcast around reading the terms and conditions of a number of big banks. And it was really, obviously, this was not a serious attempt at an entertaining podcast. It was more so pointing out the hilarity, which is the ridiculous terms that you're agreeing to when you sign on with the banks, particularly around overdrafts, right? And a lot of people just simply don't understand what they're agreeing to. So that was our point there.
Yeah, and for something like that, there's no performance element to it at all.
At all.
At all, right? At all, right? Internally, how do you justify getting the resources to do something like that, if at all you had to do it? Yeah.
In the short answer is that's not very resource intensive, right?
Okay.
But kind of the longer answer is that have impact, right? And I go again back to human behavior. Now, like let's say you heard about that podcast, right? There's almost no chance that you're going to download and sign up for Current at that moment, right? That's not really the goal there.
Sure.
But what happens next time you get hit with an overdraft fee, right? Like, and that's the time where you're most likely to convert. In the same way that I mentioned earlier with a dating example, right? When somebody all of a sudden becomes single, that's when they're eligible to download an app, and that's when they will. Maybe when you get hit with an overdraft fee, when you have a bad experience with a bank, that's when you're like, okay, you know what? Fuck it, I'm going to sign up with Current now.
Right.
Because we're top of mind when it comes to how shitty overdraft fees are.
Right. No, that makes sense. Yeah. And understandably, brand marketing isn't a precisely quantifiable thing. How do you think about evaluating the impact of brand marketing?
So it's interesting because you're right, it's not. And in many ways, what some people would categorize as brand marketing, things like TV, things like a radio, to me, that's not so much brand marketing as much as those channels are associated with brand marketing, but those can really be executed in a way that's very, very performance driven. So brand marketing, in its truest sense, is far more qualitative. Right. And again, and when you talk about like traditional marketing organizations, some of the biggest consumer brands in America, there's many ways to measure this very closely. But for a company and more of a startup like ours, it's simply going to be more qualitative.
Understood. And when you say it's qualitative, what's an example of how precisely you might want to do it? You'll be doing it.
Well, so you need to talk to, I mean, and not just talk to people within your company, right? Because then you develop something that like people in your company want. But if your consumers are different than that, and I'd say like most consumer products are not targeted towards the people who work at that company, then you need to talk to your customers. Right. And you need to gauge their impact. And there's ways to do this via surveys and things like that. But honestly, nothing's, to me, especially from a brand standpoint, nothing's better than actually talking to people.
Right.
And ideally, you can talk to people who both know your brand and people who don't know your brand, who are within your targeted audience and gauging, hey, look at this. What do you think? What do you feel? What's the
Yeah.
what and it's incredible to me that people don't do this, right?
Yeah.
Like a lot of people say they do this and say this is a good idea, and I think everybody knows it's a good idea, but it's astonishing to me how few people
Yeah.
will spend millions and millions of dollars marketing a product and literally never once speak to an actual user
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
on the phone
Yeah.
or in
Yeah.
person.
It's certainly something that surprised me just last year or two. So I worked with a myriad of companies and apps just as well. Yeah, that
Yeah.
you're right. Yeah.
I'll tell you, when you do this, it's not necessarily fun, right?
Yeah.
It could be
Yeah.
brutal,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and every single conversation you have will be frustrating to some degree, right?
Yeah.
Because like your intention, you know, is never fully realized,
Yeah.
right? And it could be really satisfying when somebody says something like, "Oh yeah, well this made me feel X, Y, and Z when it went exactly to plan."
Yeah.
But like
Yeah.
that's the exception,
Yeah.
and you're always trying to build towards that. But
Exactly.
to me, everybody will learn from that process, and it's just
Exactly. Yeah.
it's
Yeah. Yeah.
sometimes it's not fun to learn.
Exactly. Yeah. And, for your performance marketing, you clearly have a creative process, a creative iteration process. And I know you touched upon this briefly, that there are brand elements that impact how you make creatives. I'm curious how specifically your creative process looks as a result of you guys being mindful of your brand and everything that the brand needs to communicate.
So it's kind of like I alluded to before. It's super integrated. We have our brand designers and our brand marketers here. Um, we're in the same meetings.
Right.
We ideate on the creative process, and again, I'm talking about like for our performance ads,
Yeah.
um, and they have total input into that process.
Yeah.
It's not one that's happening in isolation, which like again, and me as somebody who's predisposed to performance, right? Like in many ways, I need somebody to police me on brand,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, and I think that's important.
Yeah. And for a performance marketer that's looking to be more brand conscious, perhaps because they started working in a company that requires more trust, building of trust, how would you recommend they inculcate that, and how did you do that yourself?
I think a lot of it is, I guess, just being cognizant, kind of, maybe your own deficiencies, which is certainly the
Sure.
case with myself. But just having respect for both processes, right? And
Right.
I get asked a lot is, hey, like at the top of a marketing organization, right? Is it more important to have a brand person or more important to have a performance person?
Yeah.
And what you'll see is with a lot of startups, and this is a trend that I've seen repeated several times, especially here in New York, actually, where a lot
Mm-hmm.
of traditional companies are based, where you have a startup that's been, performance led on the marketing side, and then they scale up, then they raise their Series C, then their Series D, and the numbers get bigger, and then they hire some big flashy CMO from traditional consumer brand to lead their marketing organization. It's like, well, I'll say I've never really seen that succeed.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
but to me, it's vertical specific, it's product specific.
Yeah.
There is a good argument to have that person in place if you're in the right vertical,
Right.
right? I'll bring up dating again, because I think brand is so important to that vertical. Like it's a really obvious choice where the number one reason why people may choose a dating app is because it's the cool app.
Yeah.
Not because the call to action was right and put in the right position, right? I mean, that's the reality of it.
Yeah.
But I find that for a company to which like performance and direct response is just going to be more important, it's a lot easier to find somebody who maybe is strong on the performance side, but also both has respect and an understanding of the importance of brand.
Indeed. Yeah. And oftentimes it makes sense to look at marketing holistically. Even though a lot of gaming companies don't necessarily need to look at it, doesn't mean it's not important or necessary, especially in high involvement spaces like yours, Adam.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, this conversation is
Yeah,
hilarious to a marketer 20 years ago,
yeah,
because
exactly.
we're not saying anything that they don't necessarily know,
Exactly,
right?
exactly,
But
exactly.
again, coming from a space that's strictly performance driven, um,
Indeed,
which mobile has been. And I think
exactly.
this is part of the just evolution of mobile, right? Early mobile was so gaming focused.
Yeah,
Those were just the biggest companies on mobile, and as smartphones have just become a bigger part of our lives. Mobile is not, you know,
yeah,
mobile's everything, right? Every
yeah,
single
yeah,
company has a mobile strategy. Every single business has a mobile strategy because mobile is such an important part of our lives.
yeah,
Um, that this natural shift from like, okay, super performance driven, to, you know, moving more towards the pendulum swinging more towards
yeah.
a combination of a hybrid approach makes sense.
Indeed. And I guess we've come up to the end of our time together, Adam. So this has been incredibly instructive for me. So there's certainly something we can all take away from this. So thank you so much for being on the Mobile User Acquisition Show. As we wrap, can you tell us where listeners can find out more about you?
Yes, certainly. So you can find me on Twitter at It's Adam Hadi, or on LinkedIn. Certainly, if you are interested in any of this, please check out our jobs listings at Current.
Oh, yeah.
We're hiring pretty aggressively. We're again based in New York City, in Soho. We're doing some pretty exciting and cool things here, and so always
Excellent.
looking to grow the team.
Excellent. Excellent. We'll link to that when we put out the podcast in the podcast show notes. And certainly excited to have you on the show again, Adam. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Shimon.
For more tips, pointers, and strategies from the leading edge of mobile user acquisition, subscribe to our YouTube channel right here or check out our blog, rocketship.hq.com/blog. Thank you.